Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation. My name is Kara Oosterhuis, and I will be hosting today's webinar. I'm a field editor with RealAgriculture. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are actually proud to share that the School of Public Policy has been named on the Ideas/Repix list of top policy school in 2020, as well as the only Canadian policy school to have made the list. The school's influence is reflected by its wide dissemination among policymakers, business leaders, and the media. It is Canada's most cited policy school by both traditional media and academic publications. Just before we get started here with today's presentation, I have a few quick housekeeping notes for you guys. If you have to leave early, recordings of this webinar will be posted on the school's website and also on our YouTube page, so never fear. As well as if you have heard of some of our previous webinars and you didn't get a chance to check them out, they are also on our YouTube page, so be sure to go through our archives. It's always, we've had some very interesting discussions, as well as today's will be great too. So we will have time for Q&A after the presentation and panel. We ask that you enter your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will pose them to our speakers. Like I said, we'll get to them after the three have presented, but don't feel like you have to And I believe I lost internet there for a half a second, so welcome to rural internet as well. As I was saying, if you have any issues or you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box below. We are happy to answer them. If you have any specific panelists you would like them posed to, please feel free to mention who you'd like them asked to, and we will get to them as soon as possible. So today's panel discussion will be on carbon credit systems for farmers. And today's panelists are Karen Haugen, sorry, my pronunciation is off today, Karen Haugen-Kozyra. We will also who is a president of Viresco Solutions, Hannah Konschuh, who is a grain farmer and director with Alberta Wheat Commission, as well as Aaron Delaporte, who is a senior research associate of food, agricultural, and research economics at the University of Guelph. Before we actually really dive into it deep here today, I'm going to give you a little context. Alberta's Climate Change and Emissions Act passed in 2003. It was the first legislation related to climate change in Canada. It was replaced in 2020 by the Emissions Management and Climate Resilience Act, effective January 1st, 2020. Within these statutes, Alberta's greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategy includes the carbon offset market. Essentially, when a producer makes a change in practices that reduces emissions, that producer can earn extra income by selling a credit for that work. In practice, the amount of sequestered carbon is estimated. An aggregator helps to link individual producers to carbon offset buyers, which is typically the major emitters in Alberta's various industries. And agricultural producers receive income through the aggregator. The aggregator will receive a large portion of the carbon offset prices as well. So far, Alberta has 4 approved agricultural protocols for creating carbon offsets. Number 1 is Conservation Cropping Protocol. So it's for grain farmers and other crop farmers, supporting less traffic and soil disturbance on cropped areas, resulting in increased organic matter and stored carbon in the soil. Number 2 is the Fed Cattle Protocol and Beef Genetics Protocol for feedlot operators, supports a reduction in time spent in feedlots through improved efficiencies, and supports the use of cattle that are bred for more efficient feed use in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Number 3 is Microgeneration Protocol, supports carbon offsets for either solar or wind power production, small scale and connected to the grid. And number 4, last but not least, is the Biogas Protocol. It is adopted by large biogas plants, focuses on using agricultural waste to generate methane used in electricity or renewable natural gas production. Today, we are going to discuss the Conservation Cropping Protocol and its success to date. This is the most used of the above 4 protocols. The government of Alberta estimates that about 1/3 of all cropland in Alberta has gone through the Conservation Cropping Protocol, or about 600,000 to 700,000 tons per year of carbon being sequestered compared to previous practices. Alberta farmland is divided into 2 types for these carbon calculations. The first type is dry prairie area for the southeast part of the province and parkland area for the rest. The program estimates 0.113 tons per acre sequestered for parkland and 0.057 tons per acre sequestered for dry prairie area lands. Canada's farm cultivation methods have changed substantially in the last 30 years. In 1991, less than 7% of Canada's farmland used zero-till practice. By 2016, this has increased to 59% in Canada on average and as high as 74% for Saskatchewan and 69% for Alberta. So without further ado, we are going to start the conversation off today with Karen Haugen-Kozyra. And Karen, take it away. As I said, if any of you guys have questions, we will get to them at the end, but you totally can send them in now and as you're thinking of them as they come up, and we'll get to them at the end.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Kara. I hope you can see my screen. Yes. Okay. I'm going to kick it off with a primer on the Conservation Cropping Protocol. Thank you for having me. I've been on the file for a very long time, and those protocols that were mentioned were all part of the initiation that we did when I was running the carbon offset system at Climate Change Central, an NGO seconded from government. So as we take a look at the Conservation Cropping Protocol, it was based on, is based on Canada's National Emissions Inventory methodology for assessing soil organic carbon change with change in practices. So it uses emission factors, the science underlying the National Emissions Inventory methodology. And Kara had mentioned the dry prairie, which is sort of the brown, dark brown, and the parkland is black, gray, everything else, is published in several papers at the time that Canada was formalizing its national carbon and greenhouse gas accounting verification system with Ag Canada. Basically, there are unique policy mechanisms at play within the Conservation Cropping Protocol. It was developed in the 2006 timeframe under the Martin administration with Ag Canada, Environment Canada, and a whole bunch of stakeholders. And so it's based on a 2006 draft protocol that we adapted into Alberta. So it does nationwide, but the policy mechanisms, this is the actual empirical measurements in Vend and Bygart for those two regions. You could see that the National Emissions Inventory modeling based on the calibration of the Descent model, or Century model, pardon me, results in a more conservative at 30% less estimate of soil organic carbon change under different practices on the ground. And then we do an adjustment of those emission factors, or the delta of carbon, based on the adoption rates of no-till, reduced till, and conventional till. And Kara alluded to 1991, what those were. And then to assure permanence based on a risk assessment, there is a buffer reserve that is a further discount. So in essence then, in today's Conservation Cropping Protocol, for every 3 tons that are sequestered in the soil, 1 ton is credited in the system. And the mechanism that was introduced in the 2004 to 2006 timeframe, as the working groups were working on the technical seed document, if you will, of the Conservation Cropping Protocol, were to hit a few policy objectives. So I talked about that baseline adjustment. It is known as, in the offset world, as proportional additionality. We needed to maintain the sink to date, and we need to keep growing that sink. For some reason, I'm sorry, my axes are not showing on this, but this is a 2006 timeframe with the 2006 census. And so because we could model those changes in soil organic carbon and other greenhouse gases, fuel and N2O, but now we're talking about carbon, you would set it basically to 0, and you would only be rewarded for the amount that is going forward from that time frame. So it's a proportional adjustment on the yield of carbon according to the adoption rates in the census. There we go. Sorry about that. So basically the adjusted baseline is taking that carbon to 0 and then moving forward with only additional carbon being rewarded. It was to maintain the sink, and it was to also allow new sink to be be built and stored for soil organic carbon. And so everybody gets a smaller coefficient over time as adoption occurs, but it is an equitable arrangement for the early adopters and then the late adopters as well. So this approach has been mentioned in Canada's Turning the Corner under the Harper administration policy documents, the federal US bills of Waxman-Markey and Kerry-Boxer in the Power Act from this time frame, and outlined in the Western Climate Initiative Offsets policy paper as an option for states and provinces to adopt when they're thinking about sequestration projects and maintaining the sink. Just a really quick snapshot here in terms of 2006, and that is the rates that we use in the Conservation Cropping Protocol to adjust. You could see the growth in no-till over time here, and these are prairie-wide numbers. So I'm looking at all of the parkland area across the Palliser Triangle and the dry prairie across the Palliser Triangle. And this shows you how those adjustments are done to get to the adjusted coefficients, sorry. And so this is the net coefficient, whoops. And we can see, I've got to move you guys here. We can see that prairie-wide is 0.06 and 0.12 for the two regions is the net coefficient of tons of CO2e per acre per year. Kara had mentioned slightly different numbers because those were Alberta only. Here I've done the prairie-wide ones. Okay, so next slide. As we look at conservation cropping wrapping up this year, Alberta Environment and Parks has said it's the last year, 2021, for the conservation cropping protocol to proceed based on Alberta's threshold of 40% adoption is being now no longer business as usual. There are definitional issues, I think, that are not being paid attention to in this whole arena of additionality. So the census asks these questions and growers indicate where they're at. So the census is the broadest definition. In the provincial system in Alberta, we have also surveys that we ask, but the protocol has a much tighter definition based on disturbance. And today only no-till counts and you're not allowed to cultivate at all. You're allowed to make passes and there's disturbance calculations that are done to apply seed, fertilizer, manure, but no cultivation. And that's the definition the protocol has today, which is far more restrictive than the census definition. Something to keep in mind. In terms of where we're at today, this is Biological Carbon Canada, who did an assessment of all the tonnage and the distribution of tonnage across the province, mainly by postal code. So that's why it looks a little bit coarse. But this was up to 2018, 15.7 million tons to date. And now probably by the time this protocol wraps up, we're going to see about 17 to 18 million tons. Some of the issues here, as I said, is the 40% business as usual threshold by Alberta Environment Parks, and Environment Canada Climate Change as well has said they're going to move forward with this threshold. I think there's still room for adoption. Our chief scientist, Dr. Brian McConkey, had participated in a Nature United study, which will be published next month, that talks about there's still hectares that can increase, and they did some assessments to 2030 if we can get there, and what the actual tonnage could be that could be further removed from the atmosphere and stored in soils going forward. So we will watch for that paper. And with that, Kara, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. That it's interesting, like you said, to look at it not just from an Alberta perspective, but from a prairie perspective as well. So thank you very much for giving us that insight. Thank you. I'm seeing some of your questions rolling in, so keep them coming in. That is absolutely terrific, and we will get to them at the end for sure. So next up on our list of speakers is we are going to have Hannah. And Hannah, you can take it away at any point.
Thanks, Kara. I'll just take 1 minute here to get my slides up. All right. Hopefully everybody can see that. Great. So thanks for introducing me, Kara, and a huge thanks to the Simpson Center for hosting us today for this very timely conversation. And it's so great to have Karen start us off with all that technical information to get us going, seeing as she's been so involved in protocol development over the years. So as mentioned, I'm a grain farmer and I operate generation land and grain, growing wheat, peas, barley, and canola on a dryland farm. So we're located about an hour and a half east of Calgary. And since soil is so integral to the conversation we're having today, I thought I would also introduce you to the dominant soil types that we farm on. So where I'm located, the dominant soil types are the dark brown and brown Chernozem. Of course, the Chernozem is the dominant soil type across the prairies. And one of the most distinguishing factors of the Chernozem is that its organic matter buildup. And those distinguishing features that make it a Chernozem come from below ground vegetation and below ground roots, adding to that organic matter store. So soil organic matter and soil carbon, it's critical to the productivity of the prairie soils that we grow food in. And this biological source of carbon has been widely recognized as one of the key nature-based solutions to how we can help our government and our country and our planet reach these climate goals that we're trying to reach. So there's a huge sink of carbon that exists there now, just like Karen has shown us, but there's also a potential future sink that we can't ignore. And I want to point to a couple of really key studies. I also have a master's degree in soil science. I went to the University of Saskatchewan before joining my farm, so I just can't kick that old researcher in me that wants to reference some data. So the first thing would be that in the year 2000, this was the first year that showed that the soils under crop production were actually sequestering more carbon than they were emitting. So this is sort of a really key starting point. And the next are two studies that come out of Saskatchewan. So the first is some modeling work done by Cecil Nagy and Lana Awada from the U of S. I hope I pronounced their names right, but using models and looking at all the different sources and sinks of carbon in and out of croplands, they were able to model Alberta and Manitoba soils. And on the Alberta side of things, even up to the latest year they looked at, which was 2016, it shows that our crop production soils in Alberta, with their net greenhouse gas balance is that we are sequestering carbon. So this is just a really important thing to understand as we look to these protocols going forward. And the last study that I would want to reference that I keep in mind is one that was initiated by the Saskatchewan Soil Conservation Association called the Prairie Carbon Soil Balance Project. And this project over the years 1995 to 2018 monitored soil carbon in the same fields under crop production and found that soil carbon is in fact increasing in those fields. So when these protocols were developed, and of course Karen can speak to this more, it was expected that soil carbon would level off eventually, that we would stop sequestering carbon. But what this study showed was that we are still in fact sequestering carbon. So we're not done yet. And this happens for a number of reasons that we're figuring out, including having different crops in rotation where their roots are different under the soil surface. And so carbon might be ending up in different parts of the profile. So just some really key studies to keep in mind as we look to this in the future. So one of the things that we are the most proud of on my farm is our history of soil stewardship. So my mom and dad were considered early adopters of conservation tillage. So in 1987, they seeded their crop with their first direct seeding drill, which is known as the Victory Seedivator. And this is not our drill. I found this on the internet and stole a photo of it. So the design of this drill is you can sort of see there, it's a wide shovel-like opener with seed and fertilizer chutes or boots that just drop the seed in behind once the furrow is opened. And this can be thought of as probably one of the first true one-pass seeding systems where you did it all in one go. You didn't need to do any sort of soil prep or anything to get the soil surface ready to be seeded. So this is sort of where it all began for my farm. So things have changed quite a bit for us even since 1987. So now we seed with a precision Seedmaster drill, and we have the ability to seed between the rows. And you can see there that the stubble is still standing. There's really nice cover over top of the soil surface. And the precision of the metering system on that drill is such that we can place really small canola seeds exactly where we want them. So just to get back to why these changes are made, farmers made these changes because it allows organic matter to build up. I mean, everyone knows what the dirty 30s were like. It allowed soil to stay intact in the field where you needed it. For us, one of the biggest things is that it conserves moisture. We've been so dry. Last year was the first decent crop that we grew in a number of years. So moisture is paramount to what we do. And it also allows microbial communities to thrive and to continue to turn residue into organic matter, which then feeds our crops. So we've also been participants in Alberta's various iterations of the cropping protocols. Of course, the current one known as the Conservation Cropping Protocol, which, as mentioned, is set to have its last year in 2021. So just to sort of summarize what I hope I'm leaving you with this history. So we are stewards of the land as farmers, and we're also business people. And we have a history of adapting and innovating, and soil stewardship has definitely been top of the list for that. But we're also business owners. And as we all know, over the last few years, we're exposed to a lot of risk. So that comes from trade uncertainties and weather production risks. Right now, I'm looking out the window hoping that it's going to rain and snow today because we're already quite dry. But when we make a choice to make a change to our operation, it's because the benefits far outseed the costs. And this is one of those examples. So this is an example of a practice that it benefits how I can grow crops, so my yield benefits, but one of those sort of ancillary benefits is the environment. So oftentimes economics and environmental stewardship go hand in hand, but not all the time. So I should mention that, again, before I joined my family farm, I completed my education at the U of S. So I do have a master's degree in soil science. And so this is something that's been really important for me to have as a farmer when we're making these decisions about how we do things on our farm. I'm also a volunteer director on the board of the Alberta Wheat Commission. And so the Wheat Commission, along with other groups in the province, are representing growers in this conversation with the goal to hope that farmers are represented as they should be for the sustainable practices they are doing in the various policy conversations that are going along. So Alberta, our partner organizations, we join with them to be Team Alberta. And we also work through our national body, Grain Growers of Canada. And I should mention the recent organization that formed, or the coalition that formed, the Agriculture Carbon Alliance, to do just that, to make sure that farmer practices are recognized as they should be in the policy environment as we go forward. So as we continue to go forward in a policy environment where pricing carbon is how we are going to tackle climate change, there's a few things to me that are paramount. And this is, of course, very timely. Today we heard that, of course, that the federal carbon tax is constitutional, and the provinces that were opposed to that now sort of have to figure out what going forward looks like. So as we are proceeding into this policy environment, there's three things that I think absolutely need to happen for a carbon offset system to truly be a value-added proposition for farmers. And I should mention that a couple of these points I have listed, they're really well thought out points from a Saskatchewan Soil Conservation Association position paper. And I find that they will align with all producers that are involved in this conversation. So the first, of course, is that farmers need to have a seat at the table for policy development. If you want farmers to buy in, if you want the stipulations to be workable or the verification process to be workable, we need farmers at the table providing input to that process. The second is that the system needs to be fair and transparent. So again, if the verification process is extremely onerous or has challenging stipulations associated with it, farmers, they won't want to sign on, and we'd be missing out on a real opportunity there. And of course, transparency is key, and market transparency in particular. This is not what I would say is a current tenet of the current CCP. And lastly, the compensation and the value of credits that farmers are eligible for they need to be in line with the value of the ecosystems, goods, and services that farmers are providing. So to say it a different way, how can farmers make sure that they get an appropriate piece of the carbon offset pie while also helping our governments to meet their climate change goals? So I'll leave it there, but I look forward to joining the panel today with Aaron and Karen to discuss what this looks like in the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And I know we're getting a couple questions in here asking for these references you mentioned. So I'm sure we will, we will follow up. We have a follow-up email afterwards, and we can get those references to anyone who is interested afterwards. So thank you very much, Hannah. And next up on the list, we have Aaron Delaport. And Aaron looks like he is ready to go. So go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, so thank you, everybody. Thank you to the Simpson Center for having us. Thank you, Karen and Hannah, for speaking. And basically today, so I'll take a little bit of a different tact. I'm going to talk about the sort of perhaps the on-farm economic changes that might happen or that did happen with no-till adoption. So this discussion has kind of been adapted for some work that I did across the entire prairies. It says in Alberta, it does really apply to much of no-till adoption in the concepts that we're looking at here. So on-farm changes include changes in yield potentially regarding sort of the revenue side, if you will. And sort of I think the overall average consensus that you can look at for what happens when you adopt no-till, and maybe this is conservative on the conservative side, is that there could be no change. On average, perhaps there's no change. Over time, over space, all these different conditions of soil and weather, perhaps the yield change is approximately zero. So it's not a loss in that sense. On farm, you can have costs that lower by using no-till. So you're going to have fewer passes, if you will, with machinery. That's going to reduce fuel costs. That's going to reduce labor requirements, labor costs, and it's going to lower machinery sort of costs. Now, there's a potential for short-term costs if you're changing your seeding method. But if you kind of look at comparing directly no-till versus non-no-till, if you're at the case where you need to buy a new seeder anyway, these kinds of things, those costs wouldn't necessarily come into play. Across the prairies, that kind of leaves the net return. If you consider savings on these machinery, these farming practices, you're looking at something between maybe $14 and $16, something around $15 an acre as the potential savings from adopting no-till. And then you also have some of the co-benefits that aren't necessarily evaluated monetarily always. And Hannah mentioned some of these. So less soil erosion, perhaps there's a compaction benefit, and perhaps you can reduce moisture loss. So if we're looking at, and so these farming practice changes, the estimates of costs come from essentially the three prairie province, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, their cropping budgets. So those are mentioned in the references below. If we're considering sort of the $15 an acre as sort of the net benefit of adopting no-till, and you kind of look at the potential payment from the Conservation Cropping Protocol. So this payment estimate that I have here came directly from the Alberta Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry's Agricultural Carbon Offsets Conservation Cropping Protocol webpage. It's their example calculation. It takes a $23 per ton offset and estimates that on parkland with those tons per acre that both Kara overviewed and Karen was talking about. It says that in parkland, it's something like $1.73 an acre, and on dry prairie, it's something like 87 cents an acre. So if we consider 15 as sort of the driving number from the net return side, then $1.73 or 87 cents becomes kind of a smaller portion of that, something around 10%, 6 to 10% of that sort of potential benefit just from the change in general. Now, I think one of the things that becomes interesting is even though this conservation cropping protocol is ending, We see the sort of Canada level initiatives towards these sort of practices. And we see the pricing levels that Canada is talking about. So $23 a ton would be very low if we're considering some of the numbers like 170 or something, whatever the maximum ramp up number that Canada has been throwing around as the price for carbon. So then at that point, new protocols, farms initiatives like perhaps no-till would become, perhaps could become much more lucrative than sort of the effects that we may have seen from the conservation cropping protocol, and may start to reflect, I don't want to put words in Hannah's mouth, but may start to reflect more of the fairness or equity for the services that farmers are providing. So with that, I will turn it over for the rest of the discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Aaron. If you guys could, Karen and Hannah, if you guys could turn your cameras back on, we will get to the Q&A portion. We definitely have a few questions coming in here, so very excited to get to those. The first one actually is with the conservation cropping protocol coming to an end at the end of the year and the Supreme Court ruling of today. And for those of you that do not know, the federal government, it went through the Supreme Court of Canada today that the carbon levy would be is constitutional, so it is going to continue, and that was just decided this morning. So getting back to the question, how do you see farmers being able to mitigate the impact of $170 per ton carbon tax by 2030? And does anyone have any comments on that?
Well, Kara, I can go first. Well, I think Al Mussel did a really good job on a recent paper that he released around looking at the opportunity side rather than the levy side. You know, if we have, as Hannah had outlined, fair and equitable opportunities for growers and ranchers and livestock producers to participate in carbon offset markets with those types of attractive. Right now it's 40 bucks a ton, it'll be 50 next year, and then ramping up $15 a ton up till 2030. There's an opportunity there. So it's about getting involved, getting engaged, having a seat at the policy table. And, you know, ACA is a perfect example of advocacy, I think, that's going to happen when the work gets going with Environment Canada Climate Change.
Okay, awesome. Does anyone else have any other comments they'd like to provide?
Kara, I would just add that just from my perspective as a producer, it is a huge gap. And I would, you know, thinking that we could potentially have that carbon tax of $170 a ton in the future, and then have zero sort of recognition for what is actually going on in reality in our soil. So that's a huge gap there. But I like what Aaron said about the value of carbon and how what we are looking to build for the future. It could potentially be a lot more lucrative. So I'm hoping that that is what these future protocols look like.
Another question here, aggregators get a major portion of that $1.73 or 0.87 per acre. What policy options do you all think might get more of the carbon tax benefit directly back to the farmers?
So I'll go first. And having been setting up the carbon credit trading system in Alberta, and it is a bilateral market, there is no price discovery, true, but the aggregation fee varies between aggregators. When we first started the system, we had 15 of them back in the day in 2007, and competition was a good thing. And we were seeing about 15% of the value of the carbon being retained by the aggregator for all of their fees of verification and legal, et cetera, et cetera. Today, there's only a few that are in the marketplace. So some of them, you know, return 75%, some return 65%, some return 85% back to the grower. And I always say carbon is a value chain like everything else. Show me in agriculture where the end sale of the commodity, 65 to 75 or 85% of the value goes back to the grower. That's not common in agriculture.
So what I think, as you said, Karen, though, as competition increases, or as the value increases, perhaps, of that offset, the competition to get that aggregator fee will also probably increase as well. So you could see a return to more aggregators, therefore leading to, hopefully, or I guess in that sense, a greater share going to farmers.
Yeah.
Yeah, competition would be great. And I think from just looking at the current protocol, I think that definitely that 1/3, 2/3 split between aggregators and farmers it's absolutely something that needs to look different in the future. And to potentially just throw out a wild idea here, what if there was a way that farmers could somehow be more involved at the aggregator level? Or what if that aggregator model looked completely different? So what if there was, I don't know, I'm not sure what the right terms are, but some sort of fee for service, as opposed just sort of for a way for farmers to capture more of that value instead of it getting lost sort of with the middleman.
Yeah, and I don't think the middleman it's in some ways artificial, like part of the way that they structured the market. Future structure doesn't necessarily have to include that. I mean, other options include things like cooperatives and things like that too, I guess.
I would have loved to have seen that happen in Alberta, like Team Alberta or other groups get involved in aggregation. And I mean, it's going to get more lucrative and more attractive moving forward, something to consider. Some of the situations in the other ones, like the beef protocols, some of the revenue streams will go back to ag societies or 4-H clubs, or, you know, so getting aggregators that are part of the agricultural system and embedded entities that can pass on that value in different ways would be lovely to see.
And this next question is actually coming just to you, Hannah. It says, Hannah, can you contrast and compare your compensation definition to a supply and demand system? Is that something you feel like you could comment on?
Can you say it one more time for me? I'll give it a go.
Can you contrast and compare your compensation definition to a supply and demand system?
Well, yeah, very good question. I probably couldn't. I'm someone that needs to think about that and write it down and write a report. But I mean, I guess to speak to the supply and demand thing with the aggregator, if there's, I don't know, the value of carbon, if it goes up and we're looking to the future and thinking about how farmers can contribute, obviously, if there's more demand and more value, then what I have to offer on my farm should be worth more. So hoping for that.
Absolutely. Moving into the next question, aggregators get a major portion of that $1.73 or 0.87 per acre. What policy options do you all think might get more of the carbon tax benefit directly back to the farmers? How can we really look at this one?
I mean, in some ways, I think that we've kind of examined that a little bit. But I think from like a direct policy standpoint, you don't have to have an aggregator. Or the government can serve as the aggregator in some way. Now, that's not necessarily a good outcome. Maybe it is, like I say, a cooperative that serves as an aggregator. Those kinds of things. Direct payment systems may be more difficult to manage from a government standpoint, but these are all kinds of options, I think.
And I guess I might ask Karen a question, like, does additionality and the business as usual, does that point to ways that are affecting the value going back to farmers? So if those definitions were shifted in the future, does that mean that more value could potentially go back to farmers that way?
Yeah, you know, the reason we worked on proportional additionality, we thought it would be a more appropriate way to continue the sink, right? And not lose what's been stored to date. The reality is that the yield per acre is so small, it becomes a challenge. And that was built, like the no-till protocol, the seed document was built on a no-till system. But we all know that that is a whole system of delivery of seed and fertilizer and, you know, the equipment that's on the ground, the direct seeding, the precision farming, better varieties, as you mentioned, Hannah. You know, we need to look at it as a system and not a one-off of no-till. That was very rudimentary back then. And so we've been arguing with regulators that we do need to look at a system and perhaps bundling a number of activities together to improve the eligibility of growers to participate in the system.
Okay, and moving into the next question here. This is kind of a longer one, but I think it's a good one. So why are farmers seeking exemptions from being taxed on their emissions and at the same time wanting to be compensated for their carbon sequestration/mitigation? Would it not serve agriculture better if farm groups discuss carbon balance and reward practices that meet societal decarbonization goals?
I think that's a super fair question. And a lot of it comes down to farmers not really ever having the opportunity to pass on these extra costs. So I'm paying retail for the products that I buy that I need to grow my crop, but then I then turn around and sell my product wholesale to the elevators that buy my grain. So it has to do with, policy that actually hinders competition and profitability. And when you think about farmers driving economies, there's really only so much you can take in an environment, in a business environment where your margins are so thin. So, I mean, while it's a fair question to ask, there's a lot to understand about the economics of running a farm and the environment that we find ourselves farming in.
Would anyone else like to add anything to that?
I just think that if we look south of the border with the Biden administration, everybody's sort of paying attention on what's going down there. A couple things. Number one, the carbon bank. So they've talked about a significant amount of money that can be put into the carbon bank. We don't know what that's going to do or look like on the ground. But Aaron, your suggestion of the government purchasing, right, directly, perhaps from growers that don't meet the additionality threshold and have been doing no-till for 30 years, if we're going to go down that pathway. So there's that to consider. There's also equity and competitiveness with our integrated economies, north and south of our border. And April 7th and 9th, the Canadian Agricultural Policy Institute is having a series of discussions with the United Farmers Federation around border carbon adjustments. These are looming large. So Europe has already set it out in their Green Deal, saying, you know what, if you want to export to Europe, you're going to have to meet our carbon intensity levels or we'll tariff you at the border. So, and when Trudeau and Biden met, they talked about border carbon adjustments. So we need to think about that as what we're, lobbying for in terms of exemptions and how the US will view the stringency of our products produced vis-a-vis their products. So this is another thing we need to think about in terms of market access going forward.
Karen, do you think you can expand a bit on carbon border tariff adjustments? That's another question that just came in.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. It's just, Europe has signaled quite strongly that they will want to see carbon intensity of products that they're importing into Europe meeting their standards. The Canola Council knows this. They're using ISCC in exports for canola, but it's going to apply to now all sorts of products. And the question of, WTO and whether this is legal or not, that may come into play here, but we know the WTO has been watered down in the last 10 years. So this is going to be a country to country negotiation. And we're watch April 22nd when the Biden administration rolls out its plan and what they're going to say about the mechanisms they'll be using for border carbon adjustments. What that's going to mean in the context of USMCA, we're going to have to really pay attention to that. The registration is open for the CAPI. If you go onto their website, if you want to learn more about the early discussions around carbon border adjustments.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. Another question here. There are thousands of farmers and only a small number of large emitters who are buying the credits. Would a more streamlined approach be to have all farmers receive a carbon tax credit, perhaps based on their no-till practices? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
So it could. That's possible. Another possibility, though, I guess in the future, if we're really thinking about future looking, is there doesn't have to be a small number of buyers. And there will be a smaller number of buyers than sellers, but there's if we talk about true carbon markets and true carbon offset trading, it won't be limited to Alberta. There's no reason that someone somewhere else can't buy the credits of an Albertan farmer for their purposes. If we consider global agreements, including Paris and all of the complications that go into baselines and things like that for carbon emissions. But I think that there's lots of policy potential options on the table. And sort of the development of an actual carbon market, I don't think is outside of the realm of possibility.
I would add to that we're not talking about the voluntary carbon offset market. And Mark Carney, being the UN climate envoy to finance, is wanting to ramp up the voluntary carbon offset supply by 15 times with his task force. So we need to think about all of the opportunities out there. And I'm guessing that the conservation cropping protocol may go away, but there are plenty of buyers who have made net zero pledges voluntarily, like Microsoft and Google and Apple, and lots of them out there that are willing to buy something that has the rigor behind it of a protocol that has been accepted by a government and gone through and based on our national emissions inventory. So I don't know if conservation cropping opportunities will go away after it's yanked in 2021. It may just be positioned to a buyer who will buy, as Aaron said.
Another potential, so I don't want to, I'm not going to quote anyone on this, but in some of the discussions I've heard, some of the potential includes both getting paid for environmental practices and being able to sell the carbon benefit of those practices. Being able to, in some ways, double dip is something that I've heard as a possibility also moving forward.
In the regulatory market, the proposed offset regulations, it becomes an ownership issue. So if there is a federal program in which a producer has accessed funding for practice uptake, a proportion of that will belong to the government program, and the other portion might, on a pro rata basis, be able to sell into a market. That's the proposal on the table right now. And in a compliance-based world, that's reality. In a voluntary carbon market world, may not be able to track that stuff. So, there could be the opportunity for a double dipping, if you call it that, Aaron.
Yeah, let's not call it that. Let's not call it that.
Another question coming in here, how fast will the federal offset system be implemented and how accessible will it be to Alberta farmers? Because I know that's a lot of top of people's minds, right? Everyone goes, okay, this is great, but how do I access it? Anyone have any thoughts?
There was an excellent article by Sean McGrath in Grey News yesterday. If you haven't seen it, check it out. I thought it was very well laid out in terms of where we're at. So we're kind of in a second wave of market development. Alberta had a good run, and now we're going to see Saskatchewan wanting to do its own thing. The federal government with their federal offset system, they'll be busy developing the first 4 protocols, including an enhanced soil organic carbon in 2021. Then 2022, they're going to be developing another tranche, and then the next year, a further number. So I wouldn't think that we would actually see anything until 2022 in the federal system that could be implementable.
Okay, and adding on to this, a question here for you, Karen. It says, protocol development is inherently expensive. A new soil carbon enhancement protocol is gaining interest. Who in your mind is responsible for funding new protocols for the cropping system, or cropping sector, sorry? Farmers, taxpayers, a combination of both?
Well, when we started the Alberta offset system with 15 protocols, including the precursor to conservation cropping, the government paid for those. And then later on, industry brought forward their protocol opportunities to be reviewed by the government. In the federal system, the Environment Canada Climate Change will be developing them. So, I can't speak for Saskatchewan, but they're going to be moving forward. They had consultations last week. So I think in the federal offset system, it will be investment by the government. But they have indicated in their July 2021 document that they will have a voluntary intake program. So if industry wanted to get organized and draft something, when they start their voluntary intake program, you could probably submit something and make that investment. But you're right, it's an expensive process.
I would just add that I guess from my perspective where I sit, obviously it makes sense that this is the way that our governments are trying to meet their climate goals. So it makes sense to me that they would, bear the cost and host it. But on the producer side of things, we are spending resources and time in wanting to participate in that protocol development. So that's, as of now, the way that we are using our time and resources to be involved in that development.
So shifting gears a bit, a question or a comment here says, this discussion has been about grain production mostly. Is there any similar program for forage production? Where does that fit in?
It's been a challenge. Canada has an obligation to report to the UN on soil organic carbon change under the other half of our acreage of agricultural land, and it has been elusive. This is not a Canadian problem. It is a global science gap. So right now, we're kicking off a pilot with a bunch of stakeholders, Canadian Forage Grasslands Association, on a protocol we brought through the California Climate Action Reserve. It's a Canadian grasslands protocol that will reward ranchers for retaining the grasslands on their landscapes. And so that one, we can use our national emissions inventory factors because there are land use change factors, but we don't have the science yet to confidently measure soil organic carbon change under different grazing management practices. The closest thing that's coming is the study that's just wrapping up in University of Alberta around adaptive management paddock grazing, AMP. So hopefully there'll be a protocol that comes out of that one.
Any other comments on this?
Not for me.
Another question here, what options and opportunities do we have right now? What needs to be done to ensure the right policies come in place before the end of 2021?
I might just say that it seems to me that there is a real opportunity here. Karen has mentioned that already. So the challenge that we're faced with, we're probably up against a timeline here. The protocol comes to an end after 2021, and we've just now found out that the federal carbon tax is constitutional. So now we have to sort of get up to speed and get involved and develop a protocol. But that being said, there is an opportunity because Alberta has the advantage that we've had these protocols in place, and though they weren't perfect, we can look to them and learn from them. And one other thing I would say there is that, we focus a lot on soil carbon, and we should. That's a huge nature-based climate solution that we can focus on. But Karen has mentioned this whole systems approach because there's a lot that goes along with adopting a sustainable way of growing crops. So for our fertilizer management, that's something that we do. And apparently there's a protocol for that in Alberta called the Nitrous Oxide Emissions Reduction Protocol, but apparently there's been no credits generated from that. So while there are these new ways that we can create an offset system and have a credit where, it can look similar to what the carbon credit protocol has looked like, we shouldn't turn away from that vast resource, that vast potential sink that we can have in croplands and grasslands in the future. And I just think that really needs to be an important part of what we build.
A follow-up to that is, you mentioned that the protocols aren't perfect. What would any of you guys change in the conservation cropping protocols and carbon offsets to kind of build an ideal solution?
I think that taking more of a systems level approach, like Hannah has said, in bundling in a true sustainable cropping systems way. So we do have a 4R protocol, a new NERP protocol in Alberta, but it hasn't been implementable, not for lack of trying. 2010 version 1, not. Revised again in 2015 version 2, still not implementable. So there are companies that are piloting with growers across the prairies and want to potentially bundle the two together into a cropping system. And I know Team Alberta is also working on sectional control and reducing inputs and increasing efficiency of fuels. Like if we could bundle it into a true sustainable cropping system, commensurate with the equipment and technology that we have on the ground today, I think that's probably where we want to go.
I don't think you're wrong. I don't know that we're close on that, though, unfortunately. One of the things that I think that you observe, especially scientifically in field trials, is that, and this doesn't answer the original question, it's more of a comment on what Karen was saying. You look at one practice at a time, right? And we do that economically too. We look at one practice at a time. And that is, it's not the best way to approach things in that sense, because I think that holistic systems approach is very important. It complicates, especially the carbon credit calculation, because of the interplay between the different systems that are going on simultaneously, whether they're directly additive or whether they have multiplicative effects on each other. These kinds of things are things that are certainly possible, and you could say that maybe it's not likely that they'd have negative effects on each other, and so that's okay. You could say that the baseline is sort of the minimum of the addition of all of the effects, but sort of from a short-term perspective, if we're talking about making a program better that's expiring today, I'm not sure necessarily how we could implement all of those things together simultaneously. But I like it from a future perspective.
Aaron, we have another question directed for you, actually. Your numbers showed the driver from operational cost savings was almost 10 times greater than the carbon credit driver to change operations. So this is not a successful carbon credit program. I think it is more of a changeover due to smart farmers seeing efficiencies out there. Are farmers really aligned with carbon credits and their value yet? What are your comments there?
So my general comment is that those numbers, if it's $1.73 or 87 cents an acre, those numbers are low. They wouldn't to me indicate, just from glancing at them, a significant driver of innovation across like no-till that went from the 30% to 70% in a relatively short time for agricultural innovation. So I think that it is more the practice itself, no-till, in that case. And so then it could say something about what the practices we look at in the future, because many of those practices, they might not have as sort of a certain a profit effect. So a lot of practices that we look at, some of the 4 practices, split application, even variable rate application, these kinds of things, it's very possible that those will increase profit. It's also possible that you could lose some profit, especially if they're not implemented very well. So all of these kinds of things, and it depends on weather conditions, it depends on soil type, it depends on all these different spatial factors. So no-till to me is a fairly low risk practice that has some pretty clear benefits. So just sliced off as that single piece of the sustainable cropping system, I don't see any real downside to it, and farmers would be wise to adopt it. Now, of course, there are specific locations, it may not make sense, these kinds of things, and that's why you don't see 100% adoption. But in general, carbon credit, I don't think, is the story to why no-till was adopted so significantly.
Yeah, and I would just chime in with what Aaron just said, and it's absolutely the case, and maybe that's not what everybody wants to hear. It wasn't the CCP that made my farm go no-till, but there is something to be said about the value of the credits that were established in this last protocol. So if we want to encourage the other 2/3 of Alberta farmland to go no-till, well, they're not going to do that for $1.73 an acre a year. And that's, I mean, it's estimated that, in my area, I get 87 cents an acre if I comply with the program, but after fees and allowances, it might be actually more like a low 80 cents an acre rate. So if we do want to capitalize on having more farmers go that way, there needs to be some recognition of the cost that it takes to try that new innovation, because for some farmers it's a big risk. I think about the farmers in central Alberta. They're doing things slightly differently because of their environmental conditions. So if we want to ask them to take that risk and sign on to this new protocol, some financial incentive would be really good.
I'd also add that as we get into the discussions around the Enhanced Soil Organic Carbon Protocol federally, cover crops are 40 to 50 bucks an acre. Some of the enhanced efficiency fertilizers are also going to be a bit of an economic hurdle as we get into 4Rs. And so there's going to be, a lot of discussion around the financial incentive that may increase the adoption of these sorts of things that will reduce and decarbonize agriculture.
As a quick side note though, $170 a ton will get most things done on the agricultural field.
Okay, and on that note, we are unfortunately out of time. I'm sorry we did not get to all your questions, but I'm sure if you guys have some follow-up questions, you can contact the School of Public Policy, and we will work at getting you some answers. But thank you very much for everyone who tuned in today. That's what makes these Q&As so much fun, to be able to be live with you, even though we can't really be in person right now. It's great to be able to have a bit of that conversation. So thank you very much, and thank you very much, Karen, Hannah, and Aaron, for being here today. It is wonderful to have such experts on the panel, so we appreciate your time, and thanks to the School of Public Policy and the Simpson Center for hosting us today. And for any of you, like I said, if you you will receive a follow-up email with some of the links you guys were asking to, so we will get that to you. And as well, there will be a survey, so if you have any time, please fill that out. It's very helpful to us. And like I said, thank you for providing your insight, and I'm sure we will talk to you guys all soon again.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.